The People's Volunteer Army was the armed forces deployed by the People's Republic of China during the Korean War, although all units in the Chinese People's Volunteer Army were actually transferred from the People's Liberation Army under orders of the Chinese Communist Party. The People's Volunteer Army was separately constituted in order to prevent an official war with the United States. The People's Volunteer Army entered Korea on October 19, 1950, and completely withdrew by October 1958. The nominal commander and political commissar of the CPVA was Peng Dehuai before the ceasefire agreement in 1953, although both Chen, Geng and Deng served as acting commander and commissar after April 1952 due to Peng's illness. The initial units in the CPVA included 38th, 39th, 40th, 42nd, 50th, 66th Army totaling 250,000 men, and eventually about 3 million Chinese civilian and military personnel served in Korea by July 1953. Background: although the United Nations forces were under United States command, this army was officially a UN police force. In order to avoid an open war with the US and other UN members, the People's Republic of China deployed the People's Liberation Army under the name Volunteer Army. The name was also in homage to the Korean Volunteer Army that had helped the Chinese Communists during the Second Sino-Japanese War and the Chinese Civil War, and it managed to deceive the U.S. intelligence about the size and nature of the Chinese forces that entered Korea. Technically speaking, the PVA was the PLA's Northeast Frontier Force, with other PLA formations transferred under NEFF's command as the Korean War dragged on. Strengths and weaknesses. Clothing: the CPVA soldier was reasonably well clothed, in keeping with the PLA's guerrilla origin and egalitarian attitudes. All ranks wore a cotton or woolen green or khaki shirt and trousers combination, with leaders' uniforms being different in cut and with red piping and collar tabs. Equipment: the nominal strength of a PLA division was 9,500 men, a regiment was near 3,000, and a battalion had about 850 men. However, many divisions were below strength, while those divisions opposite Taiwan were above strength. There was also variation in organization and equipment as well as in the quantity and quality of equipment. Some of the PLA's equipment was from the Imperial Japanese Army or was captured from the Chinese Nationalist Party. Some Czechoslovak equipment was also purchased on the open market. During the initial offensive in the fall of 1950, great numbers of captured American weapons were also used due to the availability of ammunition and the increasing difficulty of resupply across the Yalu River due to UN air interdiction. In addition, the Chinese produced a domestic copy of the American Thompson submachine gun, many of which found the way into Korea. Later on, after the first year of the Korean War, the Soviet Union began sending arms and munitions, and the Chinese started to produce copies of some Soviet weapons, such as the PPSH-41, which they designated Type 50. Actions during the Korean War. First phase campaign: the People's Republic of China had issued warnings that they would intervene if any non-South Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel, citing national security interests. Truman regarded the warnings as a bold attempt to blackmail the UN. On October 8, 1950, the day after American troops crossed the parallel, Chairman Mao issued the order for the NEF to be moved to the Yalu River, ready to cross. Mao Zedong sought Soviet aid and saw intervention as essentially defensive. If we allow the U.S. to occupy all of Korea, we must be prepared for the U.S. to declare war with China, he told Joseph Stalin. Premier Zhou Enlai was sent to Moscow to add force to Mao's cabled arguments. Mao delayed his forces while waiting for Soviet help, and the planned attack was thus postponed from the 13th of October to the 19th of October. Soviet assistance was limited to providing air support no closer than 60 miles from the battlefront. The MiG-15's in PRC colors would be an unpleasant surprise to the UN pilots. They would hold local air superiority against the F-80 Shooting Stars, until newer F-86 Sabres were deployed. The Soviet role was known to the U.S., but they kept quiet to avoid any international and potential nuclear incidents. It has been alleged by the Chinese that the Soviets had agreed to full-scale air support, which never occurred south of Pyongyang, and helped accelerate the Sino-Soviet split. On October 15, 1950, Truman went to Wake Island to discuss the possibility of Chinese intervention and his desire to limit the scope of the Korean War. MacArthur reassured Truman that, if the Chinese tried to get down to Pyongyang, there would be the greatest slaughter. On October 19, 1950, Pyongyang, North Korea's capital, fell to UN forces. On the same day, the PVA formally crossed the Yalu River under strict secrecy. The Chinese assault began on October 25, 1950, under the command of Peng Dehuai with 270,000 PVA troops. The Chinese assault caught the UN troops by surprise, and employing great skill and remarkable camouflage ability, concealed their numerical and divisional strength after the first engagement with the UN. After these initial engagements, the Chinese withdrew into the mountains. UN forces interpreted this withdrawal as a show of weakness. They thought that this initial Chinese attack was all that the Chinese forces were capable of undertaking. Second phase campaign. On November 25, 1950, the Chinese struck again along the entire Korean front. In the west, at the Battle of the Chongchon River, the Chinese army overran several South Korean divisions and landed an extremely heavy blow into the flank of the remaining UN forces, decimating the 2nd Infantry Division in the process. The resulting withdrawal of the U.S. 8th Army was the longest retreat of an American unit in history. At the east, at the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, a 3,000-man unit from the 7th Infantry Division, Task Force Faith, was surrounded by the PVA 80th and the 81st Divisions. Task Force Faith managed to inflict heavy casualties onto the Chinese divisions, but in the end it was destroyed with 2,000 of the 3,000 men killed or captured, with the loss of all vehicles and most other equipment. The destruction of Task Force Faith was considered by Chinese to be the biggest success of the entire Korean War. The 1st Marine Division fared better. Though surrounded and forced to retreat, they inflicted heavy casualties on the Chinese forces, who committed 6 divisions trying to destroy the American Marines. Although the Chinese were able to recapture much of North Korea during the 2nd phase campaign, 40% of all Chinese forces in Korea were rendered combat ineffective, a loss which the Chinese could not recover from until the start of Chinese Spring Offensive. UN forces in northeast Korea withdrew to form a defensive perimeter around the port city of Hungnam, where an evacuation was carried out in late December 1950. Approximately 100,000 military personnel and material and another 100,000 North Korean civilians were loaded onto a variety of merchant and military transport ships. General Walton Walker of the 8th Army was killed in an accident on December 23, 1950. He was replaced by Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway, who led airborne troops in the Second World War. Third phase campaign. Hoping to pressure the UN into abandoning South Korea, Mao ordered the PVA to attack the UN forces along the 38th parallel. On the last day of 1950, Chinese and North Korean forces destroyed several South Korean divisions along the parallel, breaching the UN defenses in the process. To avoid another encirclement, UN forces evacuated Seoul on January 3, and Chinese and North Korean forces recaptured Seoul on January 4. Both the U.S. 8th Army and the U.S. 10th Corps retreated another 50 miles, but the overextended PVA were completely exhausted after months of non-stop fighting. Ridgway took immediate steps to raise the morale and fighting spirit of the battered 8th Army, which had fallen to low levels during its retreat from North Korea. Fourth phase campaign. The overextended PVA were forced to disengage and to recuperate for an extensive period of time, but the UN forces soon returned to the offensive. On January 23, 1951, the U.S. 8th Army launched Operation Thunderbolt, attacking the unprepared Chinese forces at the south of the Han River. This was followed up with Operation Roundup by U.S. 10th Corps in Central Korea. Hoping to regain the initiative, the Chinese counterattacked at the Battle of Homsong on February the 11th, stopping U.S. X-Corps' advance in the process, but without proper arrest and recuperation. The new Chinese offensive soon fizzled out at the Battle of Chipyeongni on February 15. With the entire PVA incapable of any further offensive operations, the U.S. 8th Army launched Operation Killer on February 21, followed by Operation Ripper on March 6. A revitalized 8th Army, restored by Ridgway to fighting trim, soon expelled the North Korean and Chinese troops from Seoul, destroying much of the city with aerial and artillery bombardments in the process. MacArthur was removed from command by President Truman on April 11, 1951, due to a disagreement over policy. MacArthur was succeeded by Ridgway, who led the UN forces for additional offensives across the 38th parallel. A series of attacks managed to slowly drive back the opposing forces, inflicting heavy casualties on Chinese and North Korean units as UN forces advanced some miles north of the 38th parallel at Line, Kansas. Fifth phase campaign. The Chinese counterattacked in April 1951 with the fifth phase campaign and with 3 field armies. The offensive's first thrust fell upon U.S. 1st Corps, which fiercely resisted in the Battle of the Imjin River and the Battle of Kapyong, blunting the impetus of the offensive, which was halted at the no-name line north of Seoul. On May 15, 1951, the Chinese commenced the second impulse of the spring offensive and attacked the ROC Army and the U.S. 10th Corps in the east, and initially were successful, yet were halted by May 20. At month's end, the U.S. 8th Army counterattacked the exhausted Chinese forces, inflicting heavy losses. The destruction of the PVA 180th Division of the 60th Army during the UN counterattack has been considered to be the worst Chinese defeat during the entire Korean War. Roughly 3,000 men managed to escape, but the majority of the division were killed or captured. During the final days of the fifth phase campaign, the main body of the 180th Division was encircled during a UN counterattack, and after days of hard fighting, the division was fragmented, and the regiments fled in all directions. Soldiers either deserted or were abandoned by their officers during failed attempts to wage guerrilla warfare without support from the local people. Finally, out of ammunition and food, some 5,000 soldiers others were captured. The division commander and other officers who escaped were subsequently investigated and demoted on return to China. However, the UN counterattack was halted at Lyon, Kansas, where they were met with fresh troops from the counterattacking PVA 42nd and 47th Corps on the 27th of May, and subsequent offensive action stand down began the stalemate that lasted until the armistice of 1953. Stalemate. The UN counterattack in the aftermath of the Chinese Spring Offensive stabilized the front along the 38th parallel. The rest of the war involved little territory change, large-scale bombing of the population in the north, and lengthy peace negotiations, which started in Kaesong on July 10, 1951. Even during the peace negotiations, combat continued. For the South Korean and Allied forces, the goal was to recapture all of what had been South Korea before an agreement was reached in order to avoid loss of any territory. The Chinese attempted similar operations at the Battle of the Hook and the Battle of Kum Song. A major issue of the negotiations was repatriation of powers. The Communists agreed to voluntary repatriation, but only if the majority would return to China and North Korea, something that did not occur. The war continued until the Communists eventually dropped this issue. On November 29, 1952, U.S. President-elect Dwight D. Eisenhower fulfilled a campaign promise by going to Korea to find out what could be done to end the war. With the UN's and PVA's acceptance of India's proposal for an armistice, fighting ended July 27, 1953, by which time the front line was back around the proximity of the 38th parallel. A demilitarized zone was established along the military demarcation line, which is patrolled to this day by North Korean troops on one side and South Korean and American troops on the other. Tactics. Chinese forces used rapid attacks on the flanks and rear and infiltration behind UN lines to give the appearance of vast hordes. This, of course, was augmented by the Chinese tactic of maximizing their forces for the attack, ensuring a large local numerical superiority over their opponent. The initial Chinese victory along the Yalu River was a great morale booster for the PVA and the first Chinese victory over the West in modern times. However, by late 1951, overextended supply lines and superior UN firepower had forced a stalemate. The North Koreans that invaded in 1950 had been much better supplied and armed by the Soviets than the Chinese army had been. The main arms of the PVA were captured Japanese and KMT arms. Historian and Korean War veteran Bevan Alexander had this to say about Chinese tactics in his book How Wars Are Won. The Chinese had no air power and were armed only with rifles, machine guns, hand grenades, and mortars. Against the much more heavily armed Americans, they adapted a technique they had used against the nationalists in the Chinese Civil War of 1946–49. The Chinese generally attacked at night and tried to close in on a small troop position, generally a platoon, and then attacked it with local superiority in numbers. The usual method was to infiltrate small units, from a platoon of 50 men to a company of 200, split into separate detachments. While one team cut off the escape route of the Americans, the others struck both the front and the flanks in concerted assaults. The attacks continued on all sides until the defenders were destroyed or forced to withdraw. The Chinese then crept forward to the open flank of the next platoon position and repeated the tactics. Roy Appleman further clarified the initial Chinese tactics as, in the first phase offensive, highly skilled enemy light infantry troops had carried out the Chinese attacks, generally unaided by any weapons larger than mortars. Their attacks had demonstrated demonstrated that the Chinese were well-trained, disciplined firefighters, and particularly adept at night fighting. They were masters of the art of camouflage. The patrols were remarkably successful in locating the positions of the UN forces. They planned their attacks to get in the rear of these forces, cut them off from their escape and supply roads, and then send in frontal and flanking attacks to precipitate the battle. They also employed a tactic which they termed hachishiki, which was a V formation into which they allowed enemy forces to move. The sides of the V then closed around their enemy while another force moved below the mouth of the V to engage any forces attempting to relieve the trapped unit. Such were the tactics the Chinese used with great success at Onjong, Unsan, and Chazan, but with only partial success at Pakchorn and the Chongchorn bridgehead. Discipline and political control. Even though the discipline of the PVA was strict by Western standards, it is a notable improvement when compared to the nationalist and warlord armies. Discipline was applied universally within the army, with the party members expected to be punished more than non-party soldiers for the same infraction. Beatings and abuses were also forbidden by regulations. Although capital punishments were enforced for disobeying certain orders, it was rarely used in accordance with the Chinese traditions. Normally, public shamings and political indoctrination camps were preferred methods in dealing with serious infractions such as desertion, and the punished are expected to return to frontline duty with his original unit. Like the Soviet Army, political and military officers formed a dual chain of command within the PVA, and this arrangement could be found as low as the company level. Political officers were in charge of the control and the morale of the troops, and they were often expected to act like role models in combat. Unlike other communist armies of the same period, although the political officers had authority over military officers on combat decisions, the military officers could issue orders without political officers' approval. Similarly, the line between military and political officers were often blurred in PVA, since the political officers often had extensive military experiences while most military officers were senior party members within a unit. Besides the political officers, party members and party candidates also enforced political controls within the ranks. Squads were often divided into three-man fire teams, with each fire team led by a party member or a party candidate. Group meetings were frequently used to maintain unit cohesion, and within the meetings public shamings and criticisms were conducted to raise morale and to indoctrinate soldiers. The byproduct of the tight political control within the PVA is that it relied on the presence of the party members within its ranks to be combat effective. A PVA unit could disintegrate once the party members were either killed or wounded in action. Also, the tight political control had created a general dissatisfaction amongst the Chinese ranks, and it required constant political indoctrination and high peer pressure to maintain high morale for each soldier.